Story 1. Nabta Playa, southern Egypt/northern Sudan. C. 7000, 6000 BC. In the Nubian desert, 60 miles west of Abu Simbel, there's a dry basin called Nabta Playa. Today it looks empty. Wind. Stone. Silence. But in the 1970s, archaeologists noticed something wrong with the rocks. They weren't random. They were placed. Carefully. This wasn't a grave. This wasn't a camp. It was an instrument. Long before the pyramids, pastoral communities gathered here seasonally. They brought cattle. They brought stone. And they built something no one expected to find in prehistoric Africa, a calibrated astronomical site. Then the measurements didn't line up with Egypt. That was the problem. Radiocarbon dating placed Nabta Playa between 700 and 600 BC, at least 2,000 years before dynastic Egypt. Stone circles align with the summer solstice. Upright megaliths mark stellar risings, including Orion's belt. Subsurface slabs formed what researchers later called calendar stones. The math was precise. The alignments were repeatable. The margin of error was minimal. This was not symbolic sky watching. It was predictive astronomy. The stones track monsoon cycles, life or death information for a cattle-based society. The stars were being measured. The desert remembered. The response was immediate and quiet. Early papers framed Nabta Playa as a Proto-Egyptian ritual precursor, despite the dates making that impossible. Museum exhibits labeled it influence, not origin. Funding stalled. Excavation slowed. No raid. No ban. Just reframing. By the 1990s, most textbooks omitted the site entirely or mentioned it in footnotes. The implication was clear. Africans could observe the sky, but only Egypt could understand it. No one said it outright. They didn't have to. The people of Nabta Playa disappeared from the narrative. Their intellectual legacy was absorbed upward, reassigned to later Nile cultures. The cattle burials were called ritual, not data storage. The stones were called ceremonial, not scientific. One excavator noted it plainly. The site proved organized knowledge without kings, temples, or writing, and that made it harder to classify. A student who specialized in the site lost his funding. He never finished the work. The calendar stayed buried. Nabta Playa forces an uncomfortable fact into the record. Advanced astronomical systems existed in Africa before Egypt, built by societies without monuments or empires. Once you accept that, the timeline breaks open. Because if this knowledge was imported, it had to be local. Carbon dating pushed African science back 2,000 years. Story 2. Nok Civilization, Central Nigeria. C. 1500 BC, 300 CE. The first Nok artifact was not uncovered by scholars. It was broken open by accident. In 1928, a tin miner in central Nigeria struck something solid beneath the soil. Not stone. Not ore. A human face, fire clay, hollow, staring back after 2,000 years underground. At first, it looked like art. Then more appeared. Heads, torsos, Figures with elaborate hairstyles and calm, unsmiling expressions. They were scattered across hundreds of miles. This wasn't a shrine. It wasn't a grave. It was a residue of a civilization no one had recorded. The dating changed everything. Thermoluminescence tests placed Nok terracotta between 1000 BCE and 300 CE. But the real anomaly wasn't the art. It was what lay beneath the villages: iron slag, furnaces, smelting debris. Nok iron production appeared without a preceding Bronze Age. No copper transition. No imported method. The metallurgy was local, controlled, and repeatable. The furnaces reached temperatures rivaling later Mediterranean sites. The slag chemistry was consistent. The iron was intentional. This should not have existed, at least not according to established timelines. The reaction was swift and disordered. Excavation sites were looted almost immediately, often before documentation. Terracotta figures flooded European markets, stripped of context. Museums displayed them as isolated masterpieces, divorced from the people who made them. Scholars hesitated to publish firm conclusions. Dates were softened. Claims were qualified. The aya was framed as experimental. The civilization was called fragmentary. And the question, how iron appeared here so early, was deferred indefinitely. By the 1970s, Nok sites were being destroyed faster than they could be studied. Farming, construction, illegal digging. Entire layers vanished. What remained was enough to prove complexity, but not enough to force a rewrite. One Nigerian archaeologist spent decades trying to map furnace distribution. His field notes mention repeated permit delays and vanished samples. He trained students who never got to finish. A technological lineage dissolved in real time. Yet one detail survived scrutiny. Clay analysis revealed a distinctive isotope signature, a local fingerprint in the Nok terracotta. It was precise, unmistakable. It tied the figures to a specific geological zone. This wasn't imported art. It wasn't imitation. It was indigenous knowledge, materialized. The faces were not abstract. They were records. Nok leaves behind an uncomfortable conclusion. Advanced iron technology and sophisticated realism emerged in West Africa independently, centuries before similar breakthroughs were acknowledged elsewhere. Not borrowed, not late, not accidental. And once you accept that, another question follows. How many later civilizations inherited this knowledge without being credited? Iron technology emerged in West Africa centuries ahead of accepted timelines. Story 3. The Kingdom of Kerma, Upper Nubia. Modern Sudan. See point 2500, 1500 BCE. South of Egypt's southern border. Beyond the first cataract of the Nile, there was a city the Egyptians feared. They called it Kerma. Not a village. Not a frontier post. A capital. When archaeologists first excavated the site in the early 20th century, they expected an outpost of Egypt. What they found instead was scale. Massive walls. Planned streets. A skyline dominated by a structure unlike anything in Egypt. The assumptions collapsed quickly. Kerma's centerpiece was a western defufa, a mud brick monument over 60 feet high, built in multiple phases, with internal chambers and stairways. Radiocarbon dating placed its earliest construction around 2500 BC, contemporary with Egypt's Old Kingdom. Around it spread dense urban housing, workshops, storage facilities, and ceremonial zones. Graves contained luxury goods, gold, faience, imported materials. Kerma had wealth, Kerma had power, and Kerma did not answer to Egypt. The written record complicated matters further. Egyptian texts describe Kerma as a rival kingdom, not a colony. Military campaigns were launched against it. Fortresses were built specifically to contain it. Yet later historiography softened this reality. Kerma was gradually reframed as a rebellious province, a cultural offshoot, a civilization defined by its contact with Egypt rather than its own institutions. The language shifted. The independence blurred. The threat was minimized. The consequences were not abstract. Nubian craftsmanship, pottery, metallurgy, architecture was absorbed into Egyptian narratives without attribution. Kerma's kings vanished into footnotes. Even human remains told a darker story. Mass burials near elite tombs. Likely retainer sacrifices, indicating a complex and rigid social hierarchy that contradicted the image of a simple periphery. One excavation uncovered the remains of children buried with a ruler. They never had names in the record. Their society was flattened into someone else's story. What remains undeniable is this. Kerma was an African state that matched Egypt in urban complexity and rivaled it in regional influence. It controlled trade routes linking Central Africa to the Mediterranean. It fielded armies. It constructed monuments without pyramids and governed without hieroglyphs. It was not waiting to be civilized. It was already there. Kerma forces a reassessment of the Nile itself, not as Egypt's private corridor, but as a contested artery shaped by multiple civilizations. And once that corridor is reopened, the pattern begins to surface. Power in Africa was not isolated. It was networked. Kerma's urban scale rivaled Egypt during the Old Kingdom. Story 4. Great Zimbabwe, Southeastern Africa. Modern Zimbabwe. See point 1100, 1450 CE. In the highlands of southeastern Africa stand walls that should not exist, at least not according to the version of history once taught. They rise without mortar. They curve with intention. Some reach over 30 feet high and stretch for hundreds of meters. This was not a fort. This was not a ruin. It was a city. When European settlers encountered Great Zimbabwe in the late 19th century, they refused the obvious conclusion. The scale was too large. The stonework too precise. The layout too deliberate. So, alternative origins were invented. Phoenicians, Arabs, lost Hebrews, anyone but Africans. The verdict came before the evidence. The conclusion preceded the excavation. Archaeology eventually caught up. Stratigraphy, carbon dating, and material analysis placed Great Zimbabwe firmly between the 11th and 15th centuries, built by Shona-speaking peoples. The city contained residential zones, ceremonial enclosures, and a massive elliptical complex, likely reserved for elite or ritual use. Soapstone birds, stylized, symbolic, were found embedded in walls, serving as political or spiritual emblems. Trade goods told the wider story. Chinese porcelain, Persian glass, Swahili beads. Great Zimbabwe sat at the center of an Indian Ocean trade network that moved gold, ivory, and prestige goods across continents. The suppression was formal and explicit. Early colonial governments censored reports that credited local builders. Museums altered labels. School curricula banned the African origin theory outright. One archaeologist who argued publicly for indigenous authorship was dismissed and discredited. His publications were blocked. The site was protected. The truth was not. Official records showed decades of enforced misattribution, not due to lack of data, but fear of its implications. The cost was cultural as much as academic. Local communities were barred from the ruins. Oral histories were dismissed as folklore. The city became a symbol stripped of authorship, admired but detached from its creators. One family living nearby was forcibly relocated to preserve a neutral narrative. They lost their land. The walls remained. By the time the false theories were formally retracted in the late 20th century, the damage was done. Great Zimbabwe had already entered the global imagination as an anomaly, mysterious, unexplained, rather than as evidence of sustained African urbanism. Yet the facts remain immovable. No foreign workforce. No imported blueprints. No external rulers. Great Zimbabwe stands as proof that monumental architecture, economic coordination, and symbolic power developed deep in southern Africa on their own terms. And once this is acknowledged, the earlier dismissals begin to look less like mistakes and more like policy. Monumental stone cities thrived in southern Africa without foreign architects. Story 5, the Aksumite Empire in northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, c. 100 BCE, 700 CE, on the Red Sea coast, at a crossroads of continents. There rose a kingdom that Rome knew by name. Aksum was not remote. It was not isolated. It was listed by Persian scholars and Roman geographers as one of 4 great powers of the ancient world. Yet in modern memory, it is barely mentioned, not erased, reduced. The evidence is material and abundant. Aksum minted its own coins, gold, silver, and bronze, bearing royal portraits and inscriptions. This was not decorative currency. It was standardized, regulated, and circulated across the Mediterranean, Arabia, and the Indian Ocean. Trade records confirm exchanges with Rome, India, and Southeast Asia. The city itself was monumental. Palaces, reservoirs, and towering stone stelae, some over 100 feet tall, engineered from single blocks and erected with precision still not fully explained. Dating places Aksum's rise between the 1st century BCE and the early century CE, with peak influence around the 3rd century. Its engineers mastered stone carving, hydraulic systems, and urban planning. Its scribes developed and used Ge'ez as an administrative language. This was a literate, bureaucratic state with taxation, diplomacy, and long-distance logistics. The system was indigenous. The institutions were stable. The reach was continental. So the reframing followed a familiar route. Aksum's success was increasingly described as derivative, an African relay station for Roman commerce, a beneficiary rather than a driver. The empire's architectural and monetary innovations were explained as imported skills rather than local mastery. One could argue Aksum's prominence depended on Roman trade dominance, but the earliest Aksumite coinage predates sustained Roman commercial control of the Red Sea. The consequences were subtle but lasting. Aksum's decline was emphasized more than its ascent. Its Christian conversion was highlighted as its point of relevance, as though legitimacy arrived only with Mediterranean alignment. Local chronologies were sidelined. Engineering achievements were undertaught. Generations learned of Rome and Persia, but not the African power that negotiated with both. Aksum matters because it breaks a persistent excuse. This was not a civilization without writing, not one without global contact, not one without durable stone monuments. It met every traditional criterion and was still minimized, which suggests the issue was never the evidence. It was the framework used to interpret it. Aksumite coinage circulated across 3 continents. Story 6, Ife Civilization, southwestern Nigeria, c. 1100, 1500 CE. When the first bronze head was lifted from the soil at Ife, it caused confusion rather than celebration. The face was calm, proportioned, anatomically exact. This was not stylized abstraction. It was realism, so precise that early European observers insisted it could not be African. They searched for outsiders. They invented lost colonies. They dismissed the obvious. Ife was the spiritual and political heart of the Yoruba world. Archaeology places its fluorescence between the 12th and 15th centuries. The city supported dense populations, paved streets, and organized neighborhoods. But it was the metalwork that destabilized accepted narratives. Using lost wax casting, Ife artisans produced copper alloy heads with thin walls, symmetrical features, and controlled alloy composition. The technique required advanced temperature control. The margins for error were small. The results were consistent. Instead of recognition, the response was displacement. The bronzes were removed, sold, and displayed as anomalies, isolated masterpieces without a technological lineage. Scholarly explanations leaned outward, Mediterranean influence, ancient Greece, even Atlantis. Local guilds were ignored. Oral histories were discounted. The idea of an indigenous school of naturalistic portraiture was treated as implausible. The consequences fell hardest on the makers themselves. Ife's casting traditions were severed from their historical depth. Lineages of metalworkers, families who passed techniques across generations, were written out of the record. One master caster's descendants could name the tools, but not the century. The archive had been stripped. Continuity was broken. What remains is evidence that refuses to bend. Metallurgical analysis shows deliberate alloy choices and controlled casting environments. The heads were not experiments. They were the product of a mature system. Their realism was not imitation. It was intention. Ife did not stumble into excellence. It cultivated it, placed alongside earlier West African traditions. A pattern emerges. The sophistication did not appear suddenly. It had predecessors. Techniques evolved. Knowledge moved. And once that trajectory is acknowledged, the idea of African technological isolation collapses. The faces from Ife are not mysteries. They are records, of a mastery that was never meant to be forgotten. Yoruba metallurgy matched Renaissance-level precision centuries earlier. Story 7, Mapungubwe Limpopo Valley, Southern Africa, c. 1300 C. At the meeting point of the Limpopo and Shashi rivers, a hill rises above the plains. From a distance it looks unremarkable, but beneath it lay the blueprint for a state, one that predated Great Zimbabwe and quietly redefined power in southern Africa. Mapungubwe was not discovered by design. It was exposed by erosion and chance, revealing burials where none were expected. The placement was deliberate. The elevation mattered. Status was being engineered into the landscape. Archaeological work in the 20th century revealed a class-structured society. Commoners lived in the valley below. Elites occupied the hilltop, separated physically and symbolically. Gold objects, beads, ornaments, and a small gold rhinoceros were recovered from royal graves. Carbon dating placed the settlement's peak between the 11th and 13th centuries. This was not a village economy. It was a node. Gold moved north to the Swahili coast, then outward to Arabia and Asia. The evidence challenged long-held assumptions. Mapungubwe demonstrated centralized authority, long-distance trade, and ideological kingship before Great Zimbabwe's rise. Yet for decades, it remained marginal in the historical record. The reason was not archaeological uncertainty, it was political. During the apartheid era, the site was classified as sensitive. Research access was restricted. Public discussion was discouraged. An African origin story of early statehood conflicted with the ideology of separation and hierarchy. The suppression carried a human cost. Excavated remains were removed without community consultation. Descendant groups were excluded from interpretation. One local elder recalled learning of the site's importance only after the artifacts were already locked away. The past had been extracted. The people were left outside. Their inheritance was archived elsewhere. When Mapungubwe was finally acknowledged as a precursor to Great Zimbabwe, the recognition came late and cautiously. Textbooks adjusted timelines but rarely emphasized the implication. Southern Africa developed stratified political systems and international trade networks independently and early. Hierarchy was not imported. Wealth was not accidental. Power was organized. Mapungubwe matters because it reveals continuity rather than exception. Great Zimbabwe did not emerge in isolation. It followed a path already mapped, economically, symbolically, and politically. And once that path is traced, the notion of sudden African complexity collapses under its own weight. Class-based governance emerged in southern Africa before Great Zimbabwe. Story 8, the Kingdom of Benin, southern Nigeria, c. 1200, 1897 CE. The plaques were never meant to be silent, cast in bronze and brass. They lined palace walls in Benin City, recording generations of kings, rituals, wars, and diplomacy. This was not decoration. It was an archive, one rendered in metal. When European visitors first saw them, they didn't question their purpose. They questioned their origin. The work was too controlled, too detailed, too deliberate. Benin was a planned city with straight avenues, earthwork walls stretching for miles, and a court culture regulated by guilds. Its casters worked in copper alloys using lost wax methods refined over centuries. The plaques documented history sequentially, Court officials ranked by regalia. Portuguese traders accurately depicted. Events placed in order. This was literacy by other means. A visual bureaucracy. A state recording itself. In 1897, the system was broken by force. A British punitive expedition invaded Benin City, burned the palace, and seized thousands of artworks. The justification was retaliation. The outcome was cultural extraction on an industrial scale. Over 4,000 objects were removed in days. They were sold to museums. Their context was erased. Benin's history was disassembled and redistributed across Europe. For decades, the bronzes were admired as technical miracles, but discussed as anomalies. Their sophistication was treated as sudden, unexplained, or externally inspired. The question of how such mastery developed locally was postponed, but material science closed that gap. Analysis of casting cores revealed a distinctive clay isotope signature, the same geological fingerprint identified in much older Nok terracotta hundreds of miles inland. The connection was not stylistic. It was material, a technological lineage traced through the earth itself. The consequences of the 1897 seizure still echo. Royal lineages lost their physical records. Ritual cycles were interrupted. Knowledge that once moved through guilds and apprenticeship was frozen behind glass cases overseas. One court historian died without seeing the plaques returned. He could recite their order from memory. The walls were empty. Benin forces a re-evaluation of continuity in West Africa. The bronzes were not a sudden bloom. They were the late expression of systems centuries in the making, metallurgical knowledge refined, transmitted, and protected across generations. When that chain is acknowledged, the mystery dissolves. What remains is intent. Benin was not an outlier. It was a peak, and peaks imply ranges beneath them, older, broader, and largely unseen unless the record is allowed to reconnect itself. 4,000 historical records were seized in a single expedition. Story 9. The Mali Empire in Timbuktu, West Africa. C. 1230, 1600 CE. Timbuktu was never lost. It was ignored for centuries. It sat at the southern edge of the Sahara, functioning as a hinge between desert and savanna, scholarship and trade. When the Mali Empire rose in the 13th century, Timbuktu became more than a market city. It became an intellectual center with reach far beyond West Africa. Gold moved through it. Ideas stayed. The evidence survived on paper. Hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, written in Arabic and African scripts, covered astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law, and theology. Some included star charts, eclipse calculations, and discussions of planetary motion. Carbon dating and ink analysis placed many between the 14th and 16th centuries. These were not imported textbooks. They referenced local observations. They corrected earlier authorities. This was scholarship in motion. Yet for a long time, Timbuktu's libraries were dismissed as marginal, repositories of copied knowledge rather than original work. The city's intellectual life was framed as an echo of the Islamic world, not a contributor to it. That narrative faltered under material scrutiny. Ink composition revealed a consistent regional isotope signature, matching geological sources in the Niger Basin. the same marker previously identified in West African artistic and technological materials. The knowledge was written locally. The science was grounded here. Suppression came not as a single event, but as attrition. Colonial administrators undervalued the manuscripts. Some were taken. Many were left to decay. Later, conflict and extremism put them at risk again, forcing families to hide texts in metal trunks and bury them in sand. A librarian carried bundles of manuscripts by night. He left his home behind. The archive survived. Barely. The consequence of this neglect was global misunderstanding. For generations, Africa was portrayed as a continent without written scientific traditions south of the Mediterranean. Timbuktu directly contradicts that claim. It shows organized education, peer transmission, and long-term intellectual continuity. Knowledge here was not isolated. It circulated. It argued with itself. Placed beside earlier evidence, from Nok metallurgy to Benin's material continuity, the picture sharpens. West Africa did not produce isolated flashes of brilliance. It sustained systems. Timbuktu was one node in a much older network, preserving and extending knowledge rather than waiting to receive it. The manuscripts are not relics. They are proof. The closer these records are examined, the harder it becomes to maintain the idea that African intellectual history was thin or borrowed. At this point, the pattern no longer asks to be noticed. It demands to be accounted for. Over 700,000 manuscripts document indigenous African scholarship. Story 10, Carthage, North Africa. Modern Tunisia, c. 800 146 BC. Carthage was not defeated by accident. It was erased by design. Founded by Phoenician settlers and transformed into a North African superpower, Carthage controlled trade routes across the western Mediterranean. Its harbors were engineered for war and commerce, with circular docks, internal slipways, and centralized command. Roman writers described the system in detail because they dismantled it piece by piece. This was not a peripheral city. It was Rome's equal. That made it intolerable. The evidence of Carthaginian sophistication is fragmented but clear. Agricultural manuals attributed to Mago were considered so valuable that Rome translated them into Latin after the conquest. The city fielded professional navies, maintained complex commercial law, and operated a republican system of governance distinct from monarchies of the era. Carthage built power through logistics, through contracts, through fleets that could appear without warning. It did not rule by monuments alone. The suppression was total. After the Third Punic War in 146 BC, Rome destroyed the city, sold survivors into slavery, and banned resettlement. Archives burned. Administrative records vanished. Later Roman accounts framed Carthage as decadent, cruel, and inferior, justifying annihilation after the fact. History was written by the victor. The arson came first. The narrative followed. The human cost was absolute. An entire urban population was displaced or killed. Craftsmen, sailors, farmers, lineages ended without record. What survived did so only because Rome found it useful. One ancient author noted that Carthaginian treaties were deliberately excluded from Roman libraries. Silence was policy. Memory was a threat. What Carthage exposes is a final mechanism in this pattern. When reframing fails, Destruction follows. Where earlier African civilizations were minimized or misattributed, Carthage was eliminated so thoroughly that later generations debated whether it had mattered at all. Yet its influence persists in fragments. Harbor designs echoed elsewhere. Legal concepts absorbed without credit. Agricultural science preserved under Roman names. Carthage stands as a hinge. It links Africa to the classical world, not as a recipient, but as a rival whose legacy had to be neutralized. And once that is acknowledged, the through line becomes unmistakable. Africa's civilizations were not forgotten by chance. They were inconvenient. Rome destroyed Carthage's archives to control the historical record.